We are Year 8 students from Radder School in Cardiff, and today we are talking to Eddy Higgs about the census in the past and present.
Eddy is a historian of the census whose interests include statistical representations of society, social construction of knowledge, state surveillance of the citizen, the impact of communications on state and society, the history of information, and the history of identification. Did you always want to do something to do with the census?
Well, the short answer is no. Originally, I came across the census quite by accident, really. I was starting to do research for a doctorate at university, and I wanted to do something on the history of the 19th century seaside pier. And I discovered that somebody else was doing it, so I was in a bit of a spot, really. And then I discovered that my mother had been a domestic servant in Ireland in the 1930s. And I said this to my supervisor, that's the chap at university who helps you with your research, that she'd been a servant and I wanted to do some work on that. And he said, "Oh, well, you must use the Victorian census returns." So I did. And then when after I got my doctorate and done all my research on domestic servants in 19th century England from the census, I got a job in a place called the Public Record Office, which is now the National Archives. And I was put in charge of helping members of the public coming into the office to use the census. And that's how I got involved with it, really. And it took off from that. So it happened quite by accident, really.
My question is, have you faced any challenges or obstacles collecting census data?
There's two sorts of issues here. First of all, in my own research using census data, and then there's been the problems of the authorities collecting census data. So I'll take them in. I'll take the latter first, and then talk about my using census. The main problem that the census authorities had, certainly in the 19th century, was, of course, people couldn't read or write, and this was a real problem. I mean, imagine being presented with an official document and you can't read it. So they had to have, what they did was they had what were called enumerators, who actually went and asked people. They gave them a household form to fill out, but if they couldn't fill it out, then the enumerators came along and took the information down on the doorstep, as it were. And that only changed in the 20th century, when people started most people started to be able to read and write. I mean, you've got to remember that compulsory education only comes in England and Wales in the 1870s. And indeed, a lot of people didn't receive many years of education. My own father left school when he was 13, for example. So he could never write very well. He always used capitals, that sort of stuff. So that was a main problem they had, and it's one of the reasons why they didn't try to change the census very much, or try to keep it short, because they didn't think people could fill it in very well. Obstacles I faced looking at the census: when I started doing research on the census, there was no online censuses, there were no digital censuses. Today you can go online through something like Ancestry or Find My Past, and you can actually get online data from the census. When I started doing it, you had nothing like that. You had to go to a room in the National Archives, and they had the census all on microfilm. I don't know if you've ever seen microfilm, long reels of the stuff, and you had to stick your head in a big machine and read this stuff, and you had to copy it all out on bits of paper, and then you had to take. I had to take my stuff back to where I lived in Oxford to do the research, and then all that information had to be converted into codes. So 1 for men, 0 for women, and that sort of stuff, and then punched onto punch cards, which were 80-column little cards and had holes in them to represent the numbers. And these had to be fed into big mainframe computers. You weren't allowed anywhere near a computer. It was a huge, great thing in a big air-conditioned, hermetically sealed room. And you had to punch all these information on cards, and you had to punch instructions on cards, and you'd give it to a man. There were always men in those days in white coats who would take it away, and you'd get your results 24 hours later if you were lucky. And then you discovered you'd put a naught in the wrong place, so all the printout you got on paper was all wrong, and you'd used up your paper allocation for the month. And so you had to wait weeks before you could put in another set of questions. So it was a real problem. I mean, now with all this data online that's now available, it's much easier. So those are the two main problems, I think, or obstacles to census data. People in the past couldn't read, and when I started off, it was all terribly manual and real pain. Actually, I don't think my eyesight ever recovered. But thanks for your questions, very interesting.
What sort of things have you done in response to the census?
Again, what have I done in response to the census? Well, I filled it in. If you're asking what government has done with the census data, that's a different matter. I think the main thing that has happened in the 19th century, which is mainly what I've worked on, was that one of the reasons they were collecting the data, perhaps the main reason, was to find out mortality rates. The 19th century, there were lots of epidemics and pandemics. I mean, actually, in some ways, much worse than the one we're going through at the moment. Things like cholera, which nasty, horrible way to die. And so they wanted to try and work out what was causing all these epidemics. And one of the reasons, and they thought that it was to do with concentrating lots of people in cities, and there was no very poor sanitation. So basically, there was lots of poo everywhere, literally, and this was causing. So, and they thought that this was the reason why people were dying in the cities. So one of the things they were most interested in was finding out the number of people in particular areas and the number of deaths in those particular areas. And what this showed was that, as they expected, the places with the highest number of deaths were cities. And this then led to what was called the sanitary movement, which was basically digging sewers, putting in proper toilets, cleaning up the cities, which would lead then to, which led, of course, then to a drop in the birth rate, especially for children. In the 19th century, in many cities, I think Cardiff was a very bad one. Vast numbers of children died very, very early on as babies, simply because there was so much poo about it, and all these flies swarming all over it and getting onto babies' bottles and all sorts of stuff. And so the idea was that if they could introduce proper sanitation, things we take for granted these days, just flush toilets and drains to take the mess away, and stopping, butchers killing animals in the street and all this sort of throwing the offal in the gutter, that this would improve or lower death rates. And one of the great changes in the 19th century is the way that cities were cleaned up and became sanitary places where the chances of dying were much reduced. So I think in the 19th century, that's the important thing that happens.
When did you start learning about the census?
Well, as I replied to the question from Imogen, it was when I was doing my doctoral research, which was in my mid-20s. I started finding out about the census. Before then, I think I must have been conscious of the 1971 census because I was 19 by then, but I think my dad filled out the form, so I didn't have very much to do with it. I may have actually helped him read the form. He wasn't very good at reading. But the first time I really sort of seriously started looking at the history of the census was, I say, when I started doing doctoral research on domestic servants in the 19th century, which I must have been in my mid-20s, I suppose.
In each census, do you ever see a big change from one to the next?
That's a very good question. The first census is in 1801, but the censuses from 1801 to 1931 are very simple, and they're asking a local parish clerk to provide information. There's no individuals in the population don't provide any information. The big change comes in 1841, and that's because the body who took the census at Eddy, it's called the General Register Office, wanted to ask more questions, and so they developed this idea of household schedules and enumerators collecting data. And then there was a lot more information asked. And it was it's a new institution taking over the census, and they wanted to ask more questions on things like occupation and birthplace and that sort of stuff. Then there's a big leap in 1851 when they start asking for age, occupation, birthplace, medical disabilities, things like whether the people are deaf, blind and dumb. And then it settles down for a while, and that's because the General Register Office didn't want to expand the number of questions, because, as I said before, one of my answers, they're worried that people couldn't handle actually answering a lot of questions because they couldn't read or write very well. Then there's a big change in the end of the 19th century, and this is when other government bodies start getting interested in using the census for their own purposes. So they start asking questions about home working, because they're worried about sweaty trades. That's what people having to work at piece rates, so like a gig economy in their own home, making matchboxes and that sort of stuff. And then they get interested in a thing called eugenics, which is about posh people thought that the lower orders, you and me, were outbreeding the posh people, and this would lower the sort of intelligence and quality of the population. Load of nonsense, of course. So they started asking questions about numbers of children born to families. And then in the 19th century, they start getting interested in economic issues. So they start asking about, what business do you work for and that sort of stuff. And then later on, there are other questions that get answered as people become interested in ethnicity and sexuality in the later census and all that sort of stuff. So it's constantly changing all the time, depending on things that are partly depending on the way the census is taken, but also on the interests that central government has and the questions it wants to ask. I hope that answers your question.
Has it got easier over time to conduct a census, and how has this impacted the level of detail in the information you gather?
Well, as I've been saying before, in a sense, it does get easier as people become more able to read and write. I mean, in the past, lots of people simply could not read and write. And so if you put a form in front of them and asked them to fill it out, there's no way they could do it. So over time, it became easier. You didn't, by 1911, for example, they did away with enumerators collecting the information. They actually took in the household schedules that members of the household filled out and started using those. And now, of course, they're starting to enable you to input your information online, which I did. I did it last night, actually. Of course, what doing it online means is they can give you lots of instructions. So, you like I put in my date of birth, so they can have a question afterwards. Does that really mean you're 68? And of course, so if I'd filled it out wrongly, I could go back and change it. I mean, of course, in the past you couldn't change it because it's all written down. But now, because it's online, you can go back and alter things when you realise that you got it wrong. So it is coming easier over time. But on the other hand, the census grew, I think, very rapidly until the late 20th century. But since then, I've noticed actually the questions are getting less, actually. I mean, I was quite surprised that when I looked at my census schedules this year, they didn't ask anything about income, which they have done in previous years. So there seems to be a conscious effort to reduce the amount of information. And I don't know whether this reflects the fact that they think people are less happy to fill in, give information. It may be that over time people are getting more worried about giving out lots of information, especially to sort of commercial organisations and that sort of thing. So it may mean that they're actually having to reduce the size of the census now. And there has been an increase, a slight increase in people refusing to fill out the census. So it's difficult to answer this one. In some ways, it's got easier, and this has led to more questions being asked and making them easier for questions to be asked. On the other hand, there seems to be some resistance increasingly to provide this information. And of course, they are now talking about finding a lot of the census information in other ways. For example, from administrative data the state holds. So things are changing all the time, and it's not a one-way street, really.
What surprises has the census thrown up over time, and things that we revealed from the census that we were not expecting? So,
well, sometimes questions there are answers to questions that are a bit silly, really. And so that, like in 2001, I think there was a question about religion. And I think the third largest religion was people being Jedi Knights. People were just taking the mickey, I think. But there have been, censuses have thrown up some very interesting things. I think in many ways the most interesting thing that's ever thrown up was the 1851 census, which showed that for the first time in human history, you had a society, a big society, big country, where the majority of people lived in towns. And that was in many ways a shocking discovery. I mean, throughout the whole of human history, people lived in the countryside, in small villages or on isolated farms. And suddenly, in 1851, they discovered that people were living in cities and towns. And of course, then that has all sorts of knock-on effects, because as I've described about sanitation and all the rest. And these were issues that were really had not been thought of before. And in many ways, it changed the way in which people, especially Victorians, thought about the world they lived in. There are all sorts of issues, of course, about population movements and all the rest, which have changed the way the governments have worked and the way in which people have understood their own society. I think. I think one of the most interesting things that may come out of the next census, for example, is how people see themselves in terms of their nationality. Now, this may be most have most impact in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland has, as you may well know, has always been split between Protestants and Roman Catholics, and there's been what's called a Protestant ascendancy. My father was an Irish Catholic, and my mother was a Protestant from Ireland as well. There's always been this Protestant ascendancy, but now if the census shows that more people are actually Roman Catholics than are Protestant in Northern Ireland, that has a huge impact on the politics of that part of the country. So the census throws up really contentious things, which change the way people understand themselves, change the way governments and individuals act. So it's a very important document, actually. So thank you very much for asking a very interesting question.
Why do you enjoy finding out about and collecting information about the census?
In some ways, I'm quite a nosy person. It's quite interesting to look at other people's lives in the past. But also, I mean, the thing about the census is that, especially once you start aggregating it, putting it together and adding it up, as you've seen on the website, Populations Past website, you can find such fascinating information about people, both on the small scale, but also big changes going on nationally, and things that you can suddenly see things that you never expected to see, or rather you haven't realized. Like, there's always been this question of why families became smaller beginning of the 20th century. Why should that be? Well, you look at places where they'd already got smaller, and it turns out that you're looking at northern textile areas. Now, why should northern textile areas have small families? Well, it's because women have occupations, have jobs, bring in money, regular money, which is something which most people don't, women don't at that period. And so they can make decisions about family size. If the husband says, well, I'd like to have more children, she can say, well, no, I don't. And, if we have more children, I can't go to work. And so there's all these sorts of issues, which I find absolutely fascinating. And then you come across some very interesting little nuggets about individuals. I always was amazed the day I discovered Adolf Hitler's half-brother, who was a waiter in Liverpool, of all places, in 1911. It was fascinating little nuggets like that, which make it, on one hand, a huge data crunching exercise, but on the other hand, the census is full of individual little things which make it terribly interesting document. I always remember one of the questions that was asked in the 19th century is, what is your relationship to the head of the household? Which means that, are you a wife, daughter, son? I found an entry for an agricultural labourer living in a shed at the bottom of someone's garden, farmer's garden, and he put his relations to the head of the household as friendly, which I always thought was a lovely sort of pulling the enumerator's leg. So it's what's interesting about it is this ability to ask very big questions and yet to look at very individual things. And individual aspects of people's lives on a very person by person basis. So that's one of the reasons I find it very interesting.
Thank you very much, Eddy, for speaking to us today. It was very interesting and we really enjoyed it.
Good. Can I say thank you very much for your very interesting questions, and I hope I was able to answer them to my best of my ability. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I think all of us owe Eddy a huge thank you. So on behalf of all the students, it's been really good.